Hello, I'm Jonathan Stark, and welcome to Inside the Brackets. Today we're talking about fragmentation, how differences in browsers, screen size, platform, and hardware make cross-platform app development challenging for any developer. Joining us today are Ben Odom, Evangelist for Web Technologies at Intel, Divya Mannion, Product Manager for Edge Reflow at Adobe, and Luke Wroblewski, CEO and co-founder of Input Factory and the author of Mobile First. Luke, I'd like to start with you. When we talk about fragmentation in app development, what exactly are we talking about?
I think the better question is, what aren't we talking about, right? It used to be that you had to deal with a couple different browsers, a couple different operating systems, and maybe some screen resolution issues here and there. Now people are coming online with just about every kind of device we can imagine, and that includes, very small devices, very large wall-sized devices, soon watch devices, glass devices. All these things not only have different operating systems, but different versions of operating systems. They not only have a browser, but multiple different browsers, all of which come with their own versions. It's front and center, mobile's exploding, tablets are exploding, and developers, when they're trying to reach an audience, they have to confront this issue head on.
Absolutely. So Ben, I know you just built an HTML5 app, and you also launched it as a hybrid app. Can you describe that a little bit?
So I use the output from a bunch of Arduino sensors to build a gauge project that should be viewable on any device. One of the crazy things was the accelerometer data. Sometimes it was 0, 90, 180, 270, and others it was 90, negative 90. And so you basically had to know, depending on the device, if you're not 0 or 180, you're this way, and then you also had to do a query for, if you're 0, then this way is up. So. Yeah. I actually used our XDK new product, and we have a open source utility called Winery, remote debugging essentially, and we just outputted the sensor data as we rotated all the devices. It was a real challenge because it was actually a Nexus 4 that was different from my Galaxy 3. So wow. It was really interesting.
That's two Android devices giving you fundamentally different output.
Yeah.
Awesome. So what kind of tools did you use to address fragmentation issues, if any? So you mentioned the XDK.
Yeah, so I used the XDK, which is built using Cordova as the framework, and pretty much exclusively relied on that. And that was nice because it does a native wrapper, and you get that packaged one browser that you have to deal with. It still required some custom tweaking on UX depending on the devices, though. Unfortunately, it wasn't just straight, it handled it for me.
Yep, and I think you had mentioned to me before that you used some libraries to sort of simplify the development process.
Yeah, I used Raphael and Gauge.js, which we actually turned into a widget on our tool, so anyone can do it a lot faster later. But yeah, the libraries saved me a ton of work. I mean, without a doubt. SVGA graphics, and then some nice built-in graphing libraries were very nice. I mean, I was really looking for something that looked and behaved the same across as many platforms as possible with minimizing code base. And so I really did do a lot of searching for, not only a design that would be responsive, but a design that would scale, depending on the pixels per inch of the display.
So I'm curious, Divya, what you think about libraries and depending on that sort of thing versus maybe, learning from the ground up how to write your...
So I was part of the CSS working group and been talking a lot with the W3C people and who implement the spec and write the spec. So I think they all assume developers are going to use libraries and frameworks. The syntaxes or whatever they come up with are not things that they come up with because they are the pure or the right way to do things, but it's because it's a compromise that everyone agrees on. So I think libraries are something that will be part of our development environment. We are never going to be pure HTML, pure CSS, pure JavaScript.
And I never could have done my project in the amount of time it took me if I didn't have those libraries to rely on.
Luke, you build a lot of cross-platform apps. Can you give us an example of some of the fragmentation challenges that you've run into lately?
Sure. Well, there's a lot of the stuff that I mentioned earlier about kind of high level where the fragmentation happens. But you also encounter weird sort of collision points that you might not think about. So as a very simple example of this, we built a web-based controller for a TV interface. And you could fire up a smartphone, you could have the controller for the TV interface. What we were also doing on the phone was detecting whether or not you had a native app in the web browser. We would route you over to the native app to that URL. And all of a sudden these two things just clashed because you're trying to use the phone to control the TV, but it's trying to fire up the native app where that really doesn't exist, and so on and so forth. And there's a bunch of little things like that that have come up as we've gotten into things that interact with multiple screens, that do native and web together, that you just don't think of. Right. Because these things are colliding in unexpected ways. Today in the US, right, of the people that have a TV and a laptop and a smartphone, something like 86% of them use them simultaneously, and 90% of them use them sequentially. So not only are they sort of moving from one device to the next very fluidly, but they're also using the devices at the same time. In iOS, 18% of app time is in Facebook, which has an embedded web browser, whereas only 12% is in Safari, which is the web browser. So many people are experiencing the web in the context of Facebook. And to add even further sort of fragmentation to the issue, it's not just OS, it's not just browser, it's embedded browser, in-app, in OS, on device. The challenge we have on the web is, frankly, there's a lot more we don't know than we do know.
So Divya, are you familiar with these sort of discussions from within the W3C about why some of these things are sort of kept out of the hands of web developers?
There are a lot of device API kind of discussions happening, but it's just very, I think, nascent. I know Google is pushing for a lot of these APIs. Cordova does give access when it can through the native APIs and the JavaScript bindings. But it kind of brings back to my perspective that the web is good at certain things, and now we're pushing the envelope to do more things than it is usually good at, and that's bringing up all of these edge fractures, and I feel like maybe we should make the web better at what it's good at and focus on these other bindings later on.
Let me just be frank here. I personally think the web is kind of desperate to maintain relevance. If you look at what's happening, right, we're going to hit an age where there's 4 billion mobile connections and about maybe 1 billion or so PC ones in the next 2 to 3 years. And so 4x the audience is now on mobile. And what kind of experience do they use on mobile today?
Apps.
Frankly, they don't like to go to the web browser because it's not a very good mobile experience. So I think the people who like the web and build for the web and believe in the web, they're trying lots of things to preserve sort of the value of the web and preserve its relevance.
So let's draw a distinction between the web and HTML.
Yeah.
Actually, look, I think it was you that talked about, the web is everywhere inside of applications.
It's true.
And it seems to me that native is making progress here, but still has a long way to go dealing with things like layout, rich text, reflow, tons of things. And the standards aren't around the web per se, right? They're around HTML and CSS and JavaScript. So it's kind of interesting, the stuff that's browser specific. Do you have the same sort of fear for the of HTML as you do for the web?
No, I think HTML is a very long-living document format, and if you're going to tell me what's the sort of best bet to stick my long-term documents here, right? Document markup, I would say HTML. It's got a really, really long shelf life, and you should bet on that over other things. So to bring this back, this is why I think we're talking about this in the context of fragmentation.
Right.
HTML technologies, JavaScript, CSS, they're things which can help with the fragmentation issue because you have tons of people that know how to build it, and you have lots of different apps out there that know how to render it. And so when you're faced with this daunting thing of different OSs, different, you name it, people turn to web technologies as a solution. Which is why I think it makes a lot of sense to talk about what can they do.
Let's talk about techniques that you guys have all used to deal with fragmentation. What challenges has it presented to you, and how have you addressed it? Do you want to start, Ben?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's pretty clear. I use the library tool option to paper over the differences because, as you pointed out, multiple Android phones running different OSs, different browsers, they're only 6 months apart in time release to market, right? So, I mean, that's, I think, what you're going to have to do because, a lot of innovation starts with a small development team, and they just don't have the resources like an Adobe or even an Intel to go out there and send teams to figure out how to overcome the idiosyncrasies of, let's figure out, the top 80% of the platforms, right? And if you're just a small development shop, you've got to rely on this stuff, and you have to have a mechanism or tool to. And you're gonna make compromises. It's not gonna be perfect. There are gonna be edge cases, and you're just gonna have to go buy that device and manually tweak it.
So I actually think what you touched on is actually a viable strategy, which is picking a place to start, learning as much as you can there, and then when you pick the place to start, it boils down to what's the most viable place for me to learn quickly. That may be in a native application, that may be on the web, depending on what you're trying to do. But you start in one area, you learn, and then when you get to a point where you think you've iterated to a point where you've got what you want happening, then it's a good time to move over to multiple platforms. The other way to deal with the fragmentation issue, which was the second kind of concept I was going to throw out. So there's the libraries, they're sort of picking a platform going, which is really not trying to do as much as you're trying to do right now. Just try to do less, but do it well. And that actually plays much better in a multi-device, cross-screen, fragmented world than trying to be everything for everybody everywhere.
I agree with that. What about responsive design, responsive web design? How does that fit into the fragmentation picture?
I think it's an awesome set of tools. I don't think it's the silver bullet by any means. Those are amazing tools that help you tune things, but I don't necessarily think responsive web design is your answer to mobile, nor do I think it's your answer to this multi-device thing.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like responsive web design is web design. I mean, it's just like, why? What is the special thing in responsiveness? Because we used to call it fluid web design, and then now somehow we all got fixated into pixel-based, whatever, fixed web design, and then now we are back to responsive web design. It's just very small aspect of web design. It's just, I mean, just showing and hiding content is just one thing you can do for different device layouts and things. It's obviously, as Luke said, it's not your one true solution.
Right.
Yeah.
So not a strategy, but a tactic.
Yeah.
So what's your general advice to developers who are facing fragmentation? You know what I mean? How would they identify that their situation is a better fit for a responsive website or a better fit for a native iOS app?
If you're looking for high frame rate, that's definitely a clue for native. Heavy security, definitely a clue for native. And then, how your target device, what your business model is. Is it everywhere? Or is it just for a particular platform? Those are kind of my key giveaways. Or but if you're looking for something more of like an information gathering, a fantasy league football thing, how much time and money do you have for validation? Right. That's another big thing you got to look out for.
I think if you want high fidelity, anything super high fidelity, you should go native, and if that's super important to you, that's something you should go native for. I think there will always be a time when so-called native apps will not work at some point at some place, and so you should always have your basic functionalities be offered on the web.
I think Polar actually does that. You guys followed that exact strategy, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what we did. We, out the gates, created a native experience for creation and for sort of the richness of engagement, but then we had it right from day one with a responsive mobile web experience, or responsive experience period, that it would run in any browser, and you could sort of have the core interactions available to you there in order to deal with like URLs and sharing and linking and the like. But if I was to go back to your question for a second ago, like developer-wise, what should you do to start with? And then what we did was we created a command line interface for it. So we built like the data structures, we built some of the core actions, and we actually did the bulk of our usage of it through the command line. And then after that, we layered on a presentation interface, which is a mobile web experience, and then we layered on a desktop interface. And this was a couple of years ago. But the interesting thing about that sort of process was it forced us to think in terms of APIs. It forced us to think in terms of structure, core actions, and just all the stuff that's devoid of, ooh, look at the pretty screen. And when you have structured data, when you have all your stuff available through APIs, you are prepared to go hit whatever platform you want later. I think you want that level of underlying support. So that's where I would start. Because even if you're an iOS developer, just to put this into perspective, even if you're an iOS developer and you're like, I just make iOS apps. Great, here comes iOS 7. Your iOS 6 design looks like crap. What are you going to do? You got to change the entire front end. Right? And the more you have all this stuff intertwined, even if you're just building for iOS, you want to separate those things as much as possible so you can prepare for something like that.
Yeah, that's great advice. So I want to wrap up with a sort of free-form question for everybody. I'll start with Luke. At the end of the day, is fragmentation a problem that we can solve? Is there a light at the end of the tunnel, or is it just going to keep getting worse, and we'll just have to get more and more into our coping strategies?
Yeah. I'm not 100% sure you want to solve the problem of fragmentation, right? Because ultimately, We live in a world right now where there's probably too much choice for people. They've got way too many choices in terms of the different software, and even if they pick like one website, there's 1,000 choices on the front page of that website, and so on and so forth. So I feel like some of this stuff separates things out by fragmenting into lots of small things. So the issue that we ran into for the past 20-something years, as I kind of reinterpret history on my own here, is we had this one monolithic machine, the personal computer. And the personal computer does everything for you. And now with all this fragmentation, you're seeing things split out and be unbundled. Mm-hmm. And I think that actually creates a lot of great opportunity to create better experiences, to make things more focused, to make things more simple, more optimized, so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure I want to pull it all back into one monolithic thing again, which is, when people say cope with fragmentation, they often try to get to, like, how can I just do one thing and have it work everywhere? Yeah. Like, is that really what you want? I don't know.
It seems like you'd hit a least common denominator solution at that point.
Yeah, and I think that's the web. But again,
so the least common denominator thing is kind of a bad word.
I know.
But if it's a question between access and no access, I think it's not a bad thing.
Yes.
Right. You know,
Yeah.
at the end of the day, I feel like for most meaningful experiences, it's better to have something than nothing.
This is the tension. What you guys are describing is the fundamental tension of it's the web is reach, native is rich, and every time you try and put rich inside the web, it breaks, and every time you try to put reach inside of native, it breaks because native is limited to it's native to one platform. As long as you recognize what the two things are good for, I think you can actually use them very symbiotically and create a great sort of overall strategy.
So let's leave it at that. That's all the time we have today. Thanks to each of our guests, and thanks to you for joining us on Inside the Brackets.